Peppa Pig, the door to darkness. The day was gloomy and quiet. The wind rustled the trees outside, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Peppa and George were playing in their room, building a tall tower out of blocks. The house felt especially cozy until it started to get dark. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up and accidentally knocked over the tower, sending the blocks tumbling to the floor. George whined in frustration, but Peppa wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring at the corner of the room. There, where there had always been just a wall, now stood a door that had never been there before. It was tall, old, with a black handle. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong in their house. Maybe Mummy and Daddy built a new storage closet, Peppa thought. But the idea sent a strange chill down her spine. George, forgetting about the fallen tower, also noticed the door and pressed himself against Peppa. Peppa took a step forward. The door was closed, but a cold draft seeped from the gap beneath it. She slowly reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing. And then the door creaked open slightly. Just a tiny bit, but it was enough. From the darkness inside came a soft rustling sound. Peppa and George froze, listening. No light, no voices. Just a faint scratching noise, like something in the shadows was dragging its claws across the floor. Peppa quickly pulled her hoof away. George gripped her dress tightly. And then the door started opening wider. Creak! The darkness behind it was too deep, unnatural, swallowing up all the light. Peppa instinctively stepped back. Then it appeared. Out of the blackness, a hoof slid into view. It looked like hers, but too long, with thin fingers instead of rounded edges. Then a second hoof emerged, and then a face peeked out. It was exactly like Peppa's, but its eyes were pitch black, empty, and its mouth— the mouth slowly stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Peppa screamed and grabbed George's hoof. She bolted toward the hallway door. But then the light flickered. For a split second, everything was swallowed by total darkness. And when the light returned, the door was gone. All that remained was a blank wall, as if it had never existed. George whimpered, clutching Peppa's arm. She breathed heavily, eyes fixed on the spot where the door had been. Everything looked normal. But Peppa knew one thing for certain. It was still here. Somewhere. Watching. Peppa Pig, the Dark Mirror. One bright morning, the Pig family decided to dedicate the day to cleaning the house. They gathered their cleaning supplies and set off to organize the storage room, which had been accumulating dust and forgotten treasures for years. As Daddy Pig rummaged through the clutter, he stumbled upon an old mirror that no one remembered ever seeing before. It was tall and encased in an ornate golden frame, its surface slightly cracked but still reflecting images clearly. "Look at this," Daddy Pig exclaimed. "It will look wonderful in the hallway." Excited by the find, he dusted it off and carefully placed it against the hallway wall. The mirror added a certain charm to the space, and at first, everyone admired its beauty. Visitors also noticed it, often pausing to check their reflection. But something about the mirror unsettled Peppa. The first time she passed by it alone, she noticed something odd. In the reflection, she looked different. Her eyes seemed darker, hollow, and her mouth curled into an unnatural smile, even though she wasn't smiling at all. Startled, she stepped closer and reached out to touch the mirror. Its surface was unnaturally cold, like ice. She quickly pulled her hand away and blinked, and just like that, her reflection returned to normal. Peppa dismissed it as her imagination, but over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. Shadows flickered within the mirror, moving when no one else was around. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of figures that weren't in the room, distorted and unfamiliar. Once she saw what looked like her family, but their faces were expressionless, their eyes empty voids staring back at her. One evening, unable to ignore her unease any longer, Peppa decided to investigate. The hallway was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor. She approached the mirror cautiously and reached out to touch its surface again. This time, the reflection didn't mimic her movement. Instead, the figures inside the mirror twitched and shifted. A shadowy hand pressed against the glass from the inside. With a gasp, Peppa stumbled back as a distorted version of Daddy Pig emerged in the reflection. His face was twisted in terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. As Peppa turned to run, a faint whisper echoed from the mirror. "Help me!" Her shriek brought Mummy Pig and George rushing into the hallway, but when they looked into the mirror, it was normal again. Just an ordinary reflection staring back at them. "Peppa, what's wrong?" Mummy Pig asked, concern in her voice. Peppa hesitated, looking back at the mirror. The dark figures were gone. The room was silent, the air thick with an eerie stillness. "Nothing," she stammered. "I just thought I saw something." The next morning, the mirror was gone. No one could find it, and the house became quieter. Peppa never spoke again about what had happened with it. But as she sat in her room, she saw the strange reflection on the wall, the same Daddy Pig with empty eyes, quietly watching her. Peppa Pig, the Basement Secret. For the past few weeks, Peppa had noticed strange things. Susie, Danny, Pedro, and Rebecca had stopped coming over to play. Whenever she asked about them, the adults would give vague answers. Even Mummy Pig seemed worried, but avoided the topic. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, heavy footsteps and the creak of a door echoed through the house. Curiosity got the better of Peppa, and she carefully stepped out of her room. The hallway was dark, but a faint light was coming from downstairs. She crept down the stairs and saw that the basement door was slightly open. Inside, Daddy Pig stood with his back to her, rummaging through some boxes. In the far corner of the basement, there were cages. Inside them, dark figures barely moved. Her friends. They sat in silence, their eyes empty, as if they were unaware of what was happening. Peppa froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, but the floorboard beneath her let out a loud creak. Daddy Pig turned sharply. His face looked different, his eyes deeper and darker than usual. Slowly, he moved toward her. Peppa spun around and ran upstairs. She had to tell Mummy. Bursting into her parents' bedroom, she saw that Mummy Pig was already sitting up in bed. She looked as if she had been expecting her. For a few moments, they just stared at each other before Mummy Pig stood up, took Peppa's hoof, and led her out of the room. As they stepped into the hallway, Daddy Pig was already there. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood still, smiling. Suddenly, the house went dark. The last thing Peppa heard was the creak of the basement door opening, and voices whispering her name from the darkness. A rush of cold air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Peppa whimpered as Mummy Pig tightened her grip on her hoof. There was no hesitation in Mummy Pig's steps as she led Peppa toward the stairs. But instead of heading down, she turned toward the attic ladder. Mummy, Peppa whispered, her voice barely audible over the strange murmurs growing louder from below. "Hush, darling," Mummy Pig whispered back, pulling the ladder down with a quiet snap. "We don't have much time." Peppa hesitated, glancing back. Daddy Pig remained where he stood, his grin never faltering, his shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. The voices from the basement grew clearer now, calling her name in distorted, overlapping tones. A sudden crash from below sent a jolt through Peppa's body. She didn't want to go into the attic. She wanted to run, to escape. But Mummy Pig was insistent, guiding her up the rickety ladder. The attic was dark and cold. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and old furniture loomed like silent ghosts. Mummy Pig shut the hatch behind them and crouched beside Peppa, her breath shaky. "They know you saw them," she whispered. "They won't let you go now." A loud thud rattled the ceiling below. Peppa clung to her mother, her little heart hammering in her chest. Then, in the silence, a single voice cut through. Peppa. It was Susie, right outside the attic door.